So on this screencast, I'm going to talk about the 3/5 compromise and why it was a big deal. In the first station, we learned about the creation of the Constitution and the compromise that created the Senate, where every state had equal voting, and in the House, where it's based on population. Because of this, how slaves were going to be counted in population became a big deal. So because of the compromise, sorry about that. Because of the compromise, states cared about how citizens in their states would be counted because they wanted more votes in the House of Representatives. Slaves were considered property of the slave owners and had to be returned to their owners if they escaped. But at the same time, slave states wanted slaves to be counted as people so that they could have more population, therefore getting more votes in this new national government. Free states didn't want slaves to be counted, of course, because that would give slave states more power because they get to count their slaves toward their population. And it didn't sit well with the free states because the South wanted both. They wanted to be able to consider their slaves as property for the purposes of their free labor, but they also wanted to be counted as people for the purposes of their population in determining their representation in Congress. So they kind of wanted to have their cake and eat it too. They wanted both. It was pretty clear that this was going to be a big problem, whether to count slaves in the population, and that this conflict was between the North and the South was really problematic. And we were a pretty new country at the time, and everybody was pretty much understood that if we wanted to get really serious about this conflict this early in our inception of the country, it could rip the country apart. And we know that's true because it was 60 years later we ended up going to war over it anyway. But at least at that point we were established as a country, at least stronger, and maybe was why we were able to get through it with the Civil War. So in the end, no one had their own way. They had to compromise. The slave states got a little bit better of the deal because they could count their slaves in their population. But they couldn't have everything. They couldn't count every slave. So that's where the 3/5 compromise came up. And basically it says for every 5 slaves that they counted in their population, or that they had, they could count 3 toward their population, which would forever be known then as the 3/5 compromise. I think it's important to remember that the compromise only had to do with how to count slaves for the purposes of representation in the House of Representatives. That's the only thing it had to do with, is how do we determine how much representation that slave state got in the House? Okay, that's the end of that.